that theory of change, that you can't be too alarmist on a particular issue because it's directionally correct, I understand it. I hear it a lot. And I think empirically it's fundamentally wrong. It's not an effective theory of change. I actually think calling things straight disempowers denialists and opponents of mainstream science much more than circling the wagons and saying we're infallible, and anyone who challenges a core finding in an assessment is kicked out of the club.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, the show where we make the case for conserving nature and its biodiversity by building a robust, credible argument, one that requires us sometimes to re-examine conventional wisdom. I'm your host, Andre Marder. The intersection of science, politics, and environmental policy is full of puzzles. Why does public concern about issues like climate change surge and then fade? Why does alarmist messaging sometimes backfire? And how do echo chambers and breakdowns in trust affect our ability to make lasting progress in conservation? To explore these questions, I spoke with Roger Pielke Jr., a political scientist well known for his work on contested science in contentious policy areas, from climate and extreme weather to COVID origins and sports governance. I began by asking Roger about his broad experience in these politicized fields.
When people ask me, what is it that I do one thing. I study policy issues where science is contested and the politics are contentious. And that spans a lot of issues these days. It's a growth area. But I've worked on areas such as energy and climate change, obviously. But also I do work on eligibility standards for transgender and intersex athletes. And I've dabbled a bit in COVID science advice, including discussions of COVID origins. And the core feature of all these issues is that it's very difficult for institutions to maintain scientific integrity, given the push and pull of politics, including the politics among us experts.
Yeah, the politics has sort of different realms, doesn't it? It happens in the media, it happens in the public, and it happens in the science. And actually, the very last question I wanted to ask you was about that sort of pipeline of knowledge production and where you think the leakage might be, but I'll leave that for later. Something I've often wondered, and I'm curious as to your opinion on this, is at what point in time the environment, and I mean, I know climate is always kind of the poster child of environment, but you could speak about environmental issues more broadly. At what point in time did environmental and climate issues become as culturally and politically prominent as they are today?
Yeah, I mean, so take the long view and a very US-centric view. The modern environmental movement really emerged in the 60s and certainly into the early 70s. The first Earth Day was, more than 50 years ago in the US. The major congressional legislation passed Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the 1970s. So the early years of the environmental movement in the US were kind of a reflexive opposition to what many people were seeing as the uncontrolled advance of technology, the military-industrial complex. It was wrapped up with, student concerns about the Vietnam War at the time, and legitimate concerns about issues like pollution. At the time, concerned about global overpopulation and resource depletion were in the ether, certainly, and people talked about. And so that really was the modern origins. I would say, to build on one of your comments, climate change has, to some large degree, supplanted the legacy environmental movement. It's if you ask what is the 2025 environmental movement in the US, it's not exactly the climate movement, but boy, there's an awful lot of overlap these days. So it has really transformed from its origins in the 70s.
Right, and you can see that that's a domination of climate. You can see just, one of the indicators is the amount of funding that goes to climate versus other environmental issues. But what I meant was rather not sort of when the movement started, but when it really hit the mainstream, because my impression is that as a kid and a young student and quite far into my career, I always felt like I was the only person in the room, arguing for environmental issues. And this is sort of
Yeah,
at least well into the 20 teens.
yeah,
And then something, I guess, in that decade happened to sort of really bring it to the forefront, and it became one of the key political issues. And I guess maybe that's actually a better question, is kind of when it entered the political realm so strongly. I know it's always been there, but it
yeah.
feels, tell me if I'm wrong, but it feels to me like something changed, sometime in the past 10 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. There is an ebb and flow of political issues, but really, in the United States, you could argue that the most significant legislation, policy action happened in the 70s,
Mhm.
80s, and 90s. Um, Over the last decade, there has been a very concerted push by climate advocates to raise the salience of the climate issue. That's to be sure.
Mhm.
I mean, certainly. I mean, if you go back to 1992, George H.W. Bush promised to counter the greenhouse effect with the White House effect.
Mhm.
So it was present in presidential politics, but it became politicized in kind of a very intense partisan way, I would say, in the early 2000s. I think the Bush administration, wrapped up with the decision to go to war in Iraq and failures of intelligence. There was this growing narrative in the United States that Republicans were against science, Democrats were for science,
Mhm.
and climate change was kind of the poster child. Al Gore's movie in 2006, I think,
Mhm.
was a pretty important point. Um, so I do think things picked up from there. It is really interesting. In 2025, I just saw an opinion poll out of Germany that if you go back 5 years, 64% of Germans said climate change was the most important issue for the country. And that same poll in 2025, it's 14%.
Wow.
So public opinion has been fickle on environmental issues. And so environmental politics has always, I mean, for me, it's always been part of the backdrop of important policy issues. It almost never is it issue number one, two,
Mhm.
three, four. I mean, that's, the economy and what we're hearing about affordability. Um, and environmentalists often would like their issues, including climate change, to be number one. I would caution against that because, the number one issue is usually the most politicized issue.
Mhm.
Um, and, if you look back to the 1980s, and public opinion on ozone depletion at the time. It was not particularly high ranked. Not many people knew about it. But also, that was a decade characterized by significant progress on ozone policy.
Mhm.
So, intense public attention and concern about the environment doesn't always translate into effective policy.
Right. A bit of a sidestep, but just to get back to, and I won't ask you about the details. I'll sort of outline those in the introduction. But in the past, you've clearly fallen victim to some of the more dogmatic elements, I guess you could say, in the climate discussion. How much of the extremist rhetoric, if I can call it that, I think on both sides of the political spectrum, do you attribute to a genuine lack of good information on the one hand versus value-based interpretations of that information? Like where do you think the split is there?
Yeah, I mean, the climate issue has evolved in such a way that the public interpretations of science among the most committed on the far right and the far left become very flat. Climate science is fascinating. It's wonderful. It's complex, and the future is a very fuzzy place that we can't get perfect information about the future.
Hmm.
One thing that characterized the most political among us and all of us to some degree is that we'd really love to have evidence and facts support what we already believe or our preconceived politics. That's why I'm a big supporter of assessment processes in science, where you gather together, disparate voices with different views, to get a sense of the lay of the land, to know where things sit. And, I've gone from seeing, I'll just tell you, when I first started getting invited to testify before the US Congress, it was about 25 years ago,
Hmm.
I was always invited by Democrats. And I talked about my work on extreme weather and how it's consistent with the IPCC. Around 2013, that flipped, and I started getting invited by Republicans. But the funny thing is my testimony was pretty much the same,
Same. Hmm.
and in support of the IPCC.
Hmm.
And so I do think it is very easy and convenient for people to cherry pick and selectively pick that science that supports their case and make the best case possible. I don't think it's necessarily an information deficit or they don't know the right information. It's that people assemble bits and pieces of information in ways that makes their arguments sound the best. And, if you're in a political situation, that's kind of business as usual. But if you're, writing an insurance contract or building a bridge or, doing something that has real world impacts and you need to understand what the science says, that's where I get more concerned about scientific integrity. In
Mm.
politics, you'll never get everyone to agree on quote unquote the facts in the exact same way.
There's also this interesting phenomenon in which an expert in a particular topic can sometimes be more likely to be dogmatic about that topic because of their own perception that they know everything that there is to know, or most of what there is to know. Whereas a generalist or even a member of the public, might be more inclined to look more broadly and be more skeptical about their own views.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, on the climate issue, it's fascinating because none of us are experts on everything climate.
Right.
It spans everything from economics to, ecosystems to oceans to glaciology to, technologies of energy consumption and production.
Mhm.
So all of us have to depend on other experts. And so the most important skill, I think, in being an expert in the climate area is knowing how to draw on other experts in the area to assemble what you know, because
Mhm.
I have a certain degree of expertise, but it's very narrow and very deep, and the issue is actually very broad. So that's a huge challenge in the climate issue.
Mm. That's why these assessment processes that you refer to are so multidisciplinary, right? I'm more familiar with EPBES than with
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
IPCC, but
Yep,
I know there's especially recently there's been a real effort to have a diverse group of including practitioners, so not only scientists, but people
right.
with the field experience as well.
Yeah, I think IPBES is a great example of a scientific assessment that early on kind of pivoted towards more regional and local focus because that's where ecosystems are found. And I think at some points, such as talking about extinction rates and so on, it's tried to go the route of the IPCC, but I think it's most successful, and it's far less politicized, obviously, than the IPCC in
Right.
public discourse. That it's done a nice job learning some of those lessons.
Right, but it is interesting how I think maybe what you're referring to there is the 1 million species at risk of extinction figure,
Yeah,
which came out a few years ago. I think it was from 2019 from the Global Assessment. And
yeah,
but it's interesting how that one-liner,
yeah,
to many people, that is their best. It's
yep,
that's how media attention works, right? You grab out of all the
absolutely.
thousands and thousands of pages of research, it's sort of all boiled down to that
Right.
one slightly contentious one-liner.
Yeah, all the wonderful science and nuanced information kind of gets lost in that headline.
Yeah, and I guess that's sort of one of our biggest challenges is how do you deal with that? How do you kind of get the message across without distorting it in that way?
Right.
I mentioned sort of in the intro this frustration of mine at the way that people in my field tend to, and I have been guilty of it myself for most of my career, regurgitating existing information, so talking points. And, I guess for most of my career, my aim was to figure out how do I best get this message across.
Right.
There was no critique of the message itself. It was just sort of how do we convince others? How do we change behavior?
Right.
And I think that, looking around me over the decades, it seems that a lot of committed environmentalists, including the real experts that I mentioned just now, reflexively repeat talking points and slogans.
Right.
What's your take on why that's the case? I mean, is that just human behavior, or have you got anything else to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in areas where science encounters policy and politics, there is this idea, and it's been around a long time among experts, that if only they could convince someone else of the facts, then they would come to share my values and my policy preferences.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I hear this a lot that, well, we can't talk about policy until we have a shared understanding of facts. And so a lot of very well-meaning experts in the sciences, whether across the sciences, think that the first job is to communicate science and get people on board and have a shared understanding. And it turns out that, for better or worse, that's not going to happen. We are not going to convince the public or the publics to have a shared understanding of pretty much anything.
Hmm.
And yet, the challenge of politics is, and this is, to paraphrase Walter Lippmann, is to get people who think differently to act alike. And so the important thing, if you're interested in policy advocacy or you have a a certain set of goals you want to achieve is to work backwards from a shared commitment to action, which involves a lot of things. And for us experts, and I think we've learned this, unfortunately, very much since the pandemic, is to build a sense of trust among the public in the institutions that we inhabit. I'll go back to scientific assessments. Scientific assessments are important not because they get everything right or
Hmm.
because all experts agree or that people have to agree with them. They're important because they provide an opportunity for building trust with people who have to rely on them.
Hmm.
And so I'm a big fan of engaging with stakeholders, talking with people, but also letting them know that the experts, if we do our jobs, we're going to call things like we see them, and they can believe it or not believe it. But when it comes to action, we have to start focusing on a core set of alternative forks in the road that we could go down.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of room for people to agree on action without agreeing on facts.
You're talking about policy being more of a, or needing to be more of a goal focus rather than a process focus, right? Is that sort of a correct interpretation?
Yeah, I mean, I think both are important because the processes you put in place to achieve your goals. For example, to have a good assessment, you need processes that elicit views from people who disagree. If the ticket to entry to IPBES or IPCC is you already have to believe X, Y, and Z, then it's not really doing its job as an assessment. It's just filtering out, views that may be uncomfortable or challenging or simply wrong. So I do think process is important. But in order for political action to happen, people have to have some agreement on shared goals.
Hmm.
And so when we talk about climate change, reducing emissions is not a goal. Reducing emissions is a means. It's a means to some other goal.
Right.
And for some people, if they don't believe, in the core findings of climate science, which I think are very strong, um, there are still paths for those people to get on board with a set of policies focused on reducing emissions. Maybe they like, more efficient vehicles. Maybe their community benefits by having a nuclear power plant built there, or so the shared goal that most people have, and I talk about this a lot, is economic in nature.
Hmm.
People would prefer to be better off than worse off. And if you look at opinion polls and how people actually behave, that spans a wide range of politics. I mean, there's a few degrowthers out there, but when degrowthers start winning elections based on a campaign of making people less well off, um, I'll think harder about that. But in the United States right now, there's a huge debate going on about affordability, and that's across the political spectrum because of inflation, high costs, and if I'm interested in advancing decarbonization, I would figure out how to craft a set of policies that address affordability and have the side benefit of reducing emissions
Mm.
rather than trying to convince people of the science of climate change and why that means they must reduce emissions without ever talking about economics and affordability.
Right. And I would say even if that doesn't achieve as much emission reduction as as other policies might, because it's that important for, the sustainability of the policy.
Yeah, I mean, well, the theoretical ideal is always the enemy of the practical good enough. And so, nothing matters if you can't get it implemented in practice.
But that issue of trust that you mentioned as well, trust and credibility, I guess that it goes so closely together. I wasn't planning to ask this, and it's a very general question, but do you think that COVID and the way, especially in the US, but also many other countries, the way that the government responded, not just sort of public health related, but also COVID origins related responses, do you think that that has sort of really set science back? I mean, how big a part do you think that's played? And then maybe just along with that, how big a part do you think that some of the extreme rhetoric around climate and environment has also gone to, affect public trust in science?
Yeah, I was fortunate. I was able to lead a small project funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation, doing a comparative assessment of science advice across about 10 different countries worldwide. Um, the project started soon after the pandemic started, so spring of 2020, and most of our evaluations were the first year or the first and second year of the pandemic. And the United States stands out. The United States did not have a high level science advisory mechanism at all for the COVID pandemic. Interestingly, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. They started that sort of an effort, but it was derailed and didn't do much.
Mhm.
But if there are questions like what are the trade-offs involved with closing schools, or how effective are masks or the 6 foot 2 meter distancing, it would be nice, not because they're right, but to have a baseline of experts saying, here's what we know, here's what we don't know.
Mm.
It turns out in the fullness of time, we learned that a lot of decisions were made without any scientific basis. And that's a recipe for really compromising public trust across the board. The COVID origins issue, um, it is remarkable to me that the world hasn't been able to get its act together to do, the example I use in the United States after 9/11, there was a 9/11 commission inquiry. What do we know? What happened? It was bipartisan. Um, and the fact that the world can't get together to say, all right, let's do a true independent investigation of origins, is shocking given the magnitude of the event. If you take a look at opinion polls, there are some places, and I think Japan might be one of them, where public trust didn't take in public health didn't take as big a hit.
Mm.
We did have a Japanese case study, and one of the arguments there was that the real loss of trust after Fukushima provided some lessons to both policymakers and scientists that were appreciated during the pandemic in ways that maybe were not appreciated elsewhere.
By Fukushima, you're talking about the sort of social response, right? The sort of moving people around and that kind of
Yeah, yeah,
thing, rather than
yeah,
the technical side of things. Hmm.
right. Yeah, in which expertise, lost a lot of credibility.
Yeah.
The UK is a great example of what can go wrong because you had the SAGE, so it was the
Mm.
Scientific Advisory Group for Emergency. It's a great acronym.
Hmm.
But then a group of scientists created something that they called the Independent SAGE.
Hmm.
And so you had dueling advisory bodies, and even members of parliament were confused as to which one was the government body and which one was not.
Hmm.
So, there's a lot of lessons to learn from that. And, the most important might be that science and public health come with a lot of willingness in the public to give trust. But at the same time, it's easily lost.
Right.
And so taking care of the institutions of expertise has to be a very high priority.
Right. Just a couple of years into COVID, I was noticing the headlines, which were essentially kind of blaming the pandemic on deforestation, so very, very shortly put.
Yes.
And so with a few co-authors, we started investigating this, and we also looked into the peer-reviewed literature. And basically what we found was that in well, first of all, the primary literature does not support that assertion. So the headlines are all wrong, or they're just
Right.
highlighting one side thing. But the most shocking thing was that commentary within the peer-reviewed literature was saying almost as biased as the media was in that direction. And we got this published in Bioscience, but it's only had a handful of citations. So there seems to be a lack of willingness to kind of engage with this.
Right. I mean, that's a perfect example of a public narrative that gets established and then rigorous research is done that doesn't necessarily support that narrative, but then all of a sudden the scientists who are doing that research are perceived or targeted as undercutting something that's virtuous and good. And this is when I say scientific integrity has to be just as important as biodiversity or climate change or public health. I mean, we have to be able to do both at the same time. And I have seen a lot of examples of what you've just described in the climate space as well.
Hmm. Actually, that kind of leads into, I'll skip one question and get back to it because that leads into into another one, which is this, what you could call the heterodox dilemma, I guess. I think that, one of the biggest anxieties that people have when taking a heterodox or nuance approach, like the one that we are taking, or I see us as taking,
Yep.
is that, alarmist messaging, even when it overshoots, is at least pointing in the right direction. The idea is that criticizing the errors in alarmist rhetoric is it's just arming the denialist side of things, and let's polluters pollute more, and all the rest of it. So, how do you respond to that concern? And maybe I can just sort of remind you of something that you mentioned in another podcast where you said that I think a supervisor or a mentor of yours had said that his analogy was, when you want to turn a battleship, you don't kick it, you lean on it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so, that theory of change that you can't be too alarmist on a particular issue because it's directionally correct. I understand it. I hear it a lot. And I think empirically it's fundamentally wrong. It's not an effective theory of change. The example that I've used for a long time, and this is a chapter in my book, The Honest Broker, it was about the decision to go to war in Iraq. And, Tony Blair and, Condoleezza Rice and the Bush administration would say that, we think there's weapons of mass destruction. Condoleezza Rice famously said, the evidence for that might be a nuclear blast in an American city.
Hmm.
And if you wanted to invade Iraq, then directionally correct was to be as alarmist as possible.
Hmm.
But what we saw, what happened was, number one, when the real evidence came out that the intelligence had been corrupted and politicians weren't playing it straight, the intelligence community lost a lot of trust and support.
Hmm.
Also, people can debate this, but the actual invasion of Iraq and follow on didn't go so well.
Hmm.
And so the policy justified by the alarmist rhetoric hadn't been thoroughly thought through, in part because we had to act because everything was so important. So if we translate that to environmental issues, an issue like conserving biodiversity or decarbonizing the economy, these are issues that will evolve over decades, in the best of all circumstances, many
Hmm.
decades.
Hmm.
And public support needs to sustain, political support needs to sustain over that time, over different governments, conservatives, liberals, Republicans, Democrats, you know, labor, whoever. And so the scientific community has to ensure that that trust is maintained. One way to have that trust is to call things straight. And I actually think calling things straight disempowers denialists and opponents of mainstream science much more than circling the wagons and saying we're infallible and anyone who challenges a core finding in an assessment is kicked out of the club. And so I have a chance to talk to people across the political spectrum in the US, and there's a lot of trust of science, but it's also easily lost when scientists are perceived as being overtly political or overtly committed to a party line. So I think in all cases, whether you're in the intelligence, whether you're in the media, whether you're in science, calling things straight may not always be comfortable, especially for your political allies, but it is the best strategy for science to sustain as a trusted enterprise because we need science. It's important.
Yeah, I guess that, an underlying issue there is, you spoke, and I agree with you, you spoke about solving these environmental issues as being a decades long process.
Right.
But I guess this is the key thing is that extreme environmentalists don't believe that. They believe that there's 12 years left or whatever
Right.
AOC said a while ago, or, less than that. So maybe that's the key issue is to just actually get that message across. And it's not the only message, but to get this message across, that we do have a fairly big problem here, but it's not going to destroy the earth in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, the examples I use, and I wish climate change was approached more like these issues, but are agricultural productivity and the extension of human lifespans. If you go back 100 years and you ask, let's say, public health experts, how are we going to double the human lifespan from 39 to 78 years over the next century? The only proper answer would be we don't know.
Mm.
We're not sure. I mean, that's before you had antibiotics and modern technologies of medicine. And the way you did it was
Yeah.
incrementally. Well, we want to be better next year than we are this year. Same with agricultural productivity. If you asked, farmers in the 1930s, how's the world going to feed 9 billion people in the 2020s? The answer is we don't know. And that's okay because directionally we knew how to make improvements in crop yields and so on. And if you ask, how are we going to decarbonize the global economy? We don't know how it's going to end up, but we know how to get started. So I very much think that the climate issue has been misframed with the idea that if you pass a law or we sign a treaty, or you go to this year's COP, we can solve this problem, and it's not like that from the start.
Right. I guess this is also, I mentioned transformative change earlier on. I think this is sort of what fuels my interest in that topic and my caution toward that topic is, this idea that people behave differently when they think that there's an urgency to the situation. So
Right.
transformative change is calling for rapid and radical change and not the incremental change that you're talking about.
Mhm. Yeah. I've watched as the notion of transformative change has emerged in this space and, taken over by international assessments and the international community. I think it's a bad move by the community because most people don't want transformative change. They don't want everything to
Mm.
change. And the people who do want transformative change are people who don't have access to electricity, or don't have a job, where
It's
they
not the
can.
same transformative change that the others are talking about.
Right, right. Generally, it's talking about how do we make the rich world greener and more environmentally
Mm.
sustainable, or some vision along those lines. And I can tell you, I bet you go into a community in Tokyo or New York or Boulder, Colorado, and you say, "Hey, we're going to change everything." I think it's not a winning political message. If you say, "Well, you live how you want to live, but we're going to help you," we're going to implement some policies that makes your lives better in the way that you want it to
Mm.
be better.
Mm.
That's a different sort of
Mm.
message.
Mm. But generally, the transformative change message is I mean, there's nothing new about it in a sense. It's very utopian, right? And that goes back a very long time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Roger, I also wanted to talk to you about echo chambers. This is something which I have been fascinated about for a long time, and I actually looked into it a while ago. I wanted to do a podcast episode entirely dedicated to echo chambers and sort of how they're shaping the environmental debate and extreme rhetoric. And the research that I came up with sort of led me to believe that there's kind of nothing to see here. Well, that's what the researchers were saying, but I don't believe that.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious to know what you think. How big a role do echo chambers, particularly in social media, but also legacy media, how big a role do they play in amplifying and, I guess, entrenching extreme environmental rhetoric?
Yeah, there's a real fascinating study done by cognitive psychologists. I think one of them was at the University of Colorado, but it's titled "What Happened on Deliberation Day," and I used it in my classes for a long time. But what they did is they assembled basically a group of Democrats to talk about issues, and then they measured what they believed about the issues before they deliberated together, and they measured what they believed after. And they did this with a group of Democrats, a group of Republicans, and then a mixed group of Democrats and Republicans. And what they found is that the like-minded groups, when they deliberated together, emerged from the discussion holding the same beliefs they had when they went in, but much
Hmm.
stronger. And the groups that had a diversity of political views, they emerged being more open to other views and less certain about their own. So I do think and there's a lot of studies along these lines, but I do think there's good empirical evidence that diversity of engagement leads to more robust knowledge, better understanding of your fellow citizens, and more ability to live together.
Hmm.
So I think that social media has been particularly pernicious, particularly for the scientific community. Uh, and for the climate community, I've seen this, now for several decades. A big a big mistake the climate community has made is this idea that they need to throw out of the camp anyone who has a slight disagreement. And so the whole idea of climate deniers, which is a slur, is a signal that this person's views are not acceptable in our
Hmm.
discourse. And I've seen the term climate denier go from people who think the earth is flat to today people who support nuclear energy, for example.
Hmm.
And so the climate community has actually built a smaller and smaller tent. And partly it's to preserve the echo chamber nature of the discussion. And it also reflects a misunderstanding of how politics actually works. Politics works because people who you may violently disagree with come together and make decisions. I was lucky. I got to work in the U.S. Congress early in my career, and in a big sprawling country, today of 330 million, people have all sorts of views and beliefs. And if you're going to get people to come together and make decisions, then you throw people out of the tent at your own peril because you're going to become more of a niche issue. There's also, I mean, there's another phrase that I think is important here. It's not just echo chambers, but epistemic
Hmm.
bubbles is another term that I like, where people from a shared, let's say, intellectual community or have a shared intellectual understanding of issues, only talk to each other, and they don't recognize that there's a lot of different ways to get at the truth, and we have to be, I guess, ecumenical in our epistemology and understand that it's I guess the analogy is like the blind men and the elephant. We're all trying to get a sense of the real world, and none of us get it, but together we're a lot stronger than just with the people who think like we do.
Yeah. At the risk of treading on politically sensitive ground, I think, a lot of what you said now is about ideological diversity, right? And my
Hmm.
impression is that, a lot of the conversation, I guess, in various political spheres is kind of a replacement of ideological diversity with other kinds of identity related diversity.
Yeah,
It's sort of like a placeholder for something which is much more important, I guess, and especially in discussions like this, as that lovely example you gave at the beginning is such a good illustration of that. It doesn't matter what people's sort of racial or gender related or whatever it is background is. What matters is ideas, and that's kind of
right.
what's missed, I think.
No, I think, I mean, particularly in big democracies that have a diversity of folks, you want to have a wide engagement of people from different backgrounds. And, one of the challenges that academia and science faces in the US, public health historically has had this problem, is that when people from Black communities or Hispanic communities look at the expert bodies that are advising them, they don't see themselves,
Mm,
or they see themselves very little. And we have to understand that's an important component of trust.
yeah.
I mean, and so the whole problem with it's not the whole problem, but a big problem with DEI in the US was the impression that people were advancing not based on merit.
Hmm.
And this country is big enough. There's so many
Mm,
universities. There is an incredible diversity of people who participate that if you have your COVID advisory committee and it's just white men over 60, then you're doing that by choice. You don't have to do that. So I do think all types of diversity matter, but you don't have to compromise on merit to have great diversity on your expert advisory bodies, for
hmm.
example.
Yeah, no, point well taken. Um, So this is to go back to something that I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, this kind of knowledge pipeline. I'm curious to hear your opinion on this. So the way I see it, there are multiple points where accurate scientific understanding can get distorted, on its way to the public and to policymakers. So could you walk through this chain, and I'll sort of tell you what I think the chain looks like, and tell us where you think the biggest distortions typically occur. So the way I see it is it starts with, I guess, the education and training of scientists at universities and maybe even earlier than that. And then the second step would be their production of peer-reviewed papers. So, getting their ideas into
Yep.
the public realm, but the specialized public realm. And then the synthesis of these papers, this doesn't always happen, but the synthesis of these papers into assessment reports like the IPCC's and IPS's reports. And then the drafting, and especially the government approved summary of policymakers. So you get this full 2,000 page report, which nobody ever reads. And then you get the SPM, which five people read, right? And then
Right, right.
finally, the media interpretation and coverage of these reports, which is, that's where it kind of explodes onto the scene. But at each of these points, there's potential for distortion. So I'm curious to know, and maybe this is sort of deviating a little bit from what we were just talking about, but I think it relates a lot to some of the earlier discussion. What's your view on kind of where things can go wrong here, and maybe any sort of recommendations you might have?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I guess I'll start by taking issue with the notion of a
Hmm.
pipeline, which for me is far too linear in its
Yeah, yeah,
conception.
fair enough.
I tend to think, and it depends also, is, are we talking about public understanding of expert knowledge? Are we talking about policymaker understanding? Are we talking about how expert knowledge is represented in actual decision documents and so on? So those details matter, but I would think of it more like cooking a stew. And some people, you're cutting up your potatoes, and somebody's cutting the carrots, and you get the broth, and you put the seasoning in, and to cook a good stew, once you serve the stew, it's very hard to say, well, this element came from the potato, and so understandings of expert knowledge are shaped in a lot of important ways, and the media is a big part, obviously, and the fracturing of the media over recent decades is a big part of the story. I mean, I have to tell you, one of my daily moments of panic is, I'll read, let's say, the New York Times, which I read every day,
Hmm.
and I'll read something in the climate space where I'm an expert, and I'll say, oh my gosh, that is completely wrong.
Hmm.
So I wrote a piece earlier this week about insurance and climate change. New York Times has been very wrong on that issue for a while. But then I read something about Venezuela or, foreign policy or public health where I'm not an expert. And I think, so is it possible, likely that the reporting here is just as bad as, what I just read in my
Yep.
area? And I don't have good advice for people. How do you know what's what is really difficult because things break down. As as I said many times, I am a big supporter of institutionalizing expertise, and that could be a newspaper, could be an assessment process. It could be a National Academy of Sciences of the sort. It could be a formal government advisory body. But if we can set up formal mechanisms for trying to allow relevant experts, and that's a diversity of experts, to call things like they see them, that to me offers a much more effective, more efficient route to at least getting some baseline knowledge than
Hmm.
reading the Financial Times, the New York Times, whatever, all the newspapers, and try to triangulate knowledge, or picking your favorite expert that's out there, or politician, and saying, well, if RFK Jr. in the United States doesn't like vaccines, then, well, it must be true. That's not a good way to go about getting knowledge. So, and things can break down at every step of the way. I write a lot about failures of peer review, about how bad data gets into actual science, about how assessment processes break down. The key to that is not papering it over or pretending like it doesn't exist. The key to that is having institutions with the commitment to get things right. And so we just saw, just in the last week or so, Nature retracted a climate economics
Yeah, I
paper.
saw that.
Really impactful. Yeah. But the scandal isn't that the paper was retracted or it was flawed. That happens a lot in science. The scandal is it took 18
Yeah.
months. And in the meantime, governments and NGOs have relied heavily on that paper. So institutions need a commitment to continuous improvement, I think, is the key to avoid those
All
breakdowns.
right. And there does seem to be, I'm thinking particularly of certain journals, there does seem to have been a politicization of journals, which I haven't noticed in the past, which seems to have happened recently. And
Right.
maybe COVID has also kind of, just pushed things in that direction. I'm not sure if we can blame it on that as well, but that's very worrying, when sort of major journals where, and when I mentioned, just for the listeners who aren't aware of, I didn't mention that that step from peer-reviewed journal research to assessments, the assessors in the IPBES and IPCC assessments are using only what's already there. They're not creating any new
Right.
science. It's basically a giant literature review, although they don't
Right.
like that wording, but it's essentially
Right.
what it is. So when that science is faulty, or skewed one way or another, then we've got a pretty serious problem.
Right.
And this always, because of all these leakages, I'm sometimes kind of amazed that we can get anything done. It's kind of, it seems
Right.
like,
Right. Right. Right.
and yet we do. So perhaps it's not quite as bad as we think it is. The
Well, yeah, my view very much, and I always have to remind myself to tell people this, that the connections of science and policy across the board generally work
mm,
fantastic around the world. Um, and look at the aviation and airline safety, how it's improved. Science works, and that's not a particularly politicized issue. There are these issues, and vaccination in the United States, climate change worldwide, energy policy. transgender athletes, where issues of science do become highly politicized. And those are the ones I think that we have to take care of, because they are exceptional. They are not like how things normally work across the board, where, for most people it's boring. I just want the lights to come on. I want the subway to pick me up on time. And science does great in most settings. It's the ones where it's breaks down that I think we need to focus on.
Join me again next time when I speak to Salim Ali about the relative costs of renewable energy and other forms of energy, especially fossil fuel energy, and their impacts on the environment.